Look, I love the old Bleach anime, but there's no denying they made some questionable decisions over the course of those 366 episodes, including some pretty downright transformative examples of censorship. Thankfully, one of the biggest advantages of the current Thousand Year Blood War arc anime is that its later time slot in Japan means it's able to be almost completely devoid of censorship across the board, ensuring the final arc of Bleach can be enjoyed and experienced almost exactly as was intended in the manga, which is especially evident in how faithful the anime often feels in regards to its overall presentation. But today I wanted to reminisce over some of the craziest, most egregious and famous examples of censorship found in the original anime, from toning down devastating wounds to altering transformations and more, in an effort to make Bleach more child-friendly. Many of the series' most iconic moments were, for lack of a better term, kind of butchered. Really, one of the biggest reasons why a remake of the original anime would be warranted is in achieving parity with the manga, and as you'll see from some of these examples, there's a lot to be done here. Now, before we take a look at the following examples of censorship from the original Bleach manga, which are in chronological order, let me remind you, this is just a small sample, a selection of scenes from the anime, those that really do still stick out to me today most of all, but there's going to be potentially hundreds of examples that don't appear in this video. And then of course on top of that there's the more blanket, universal examples of censorship too, such as certain female characters having their outfits modified like Soifon or famously Harabel, or a lack of blood and injury in general. And while these examples of censorship are widespread throughout, this particular video is going to be looking and focusing on specific scenes, and if I missed a specific moment that's really stayed with you over the years, then make sure to let me know down in the comments. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't done already, consider hitting subscribe down below today to help the channel continue to grow. It really is greatly appreciated. It's super quick and easy to do, and your support does mean the absolute world to me. And I just released over on Mr. Tomo Talks Games an in-depth ranking of every single boss from the first Berserker Kazan, probably the hardest game I've ever played in my life. So if you're interested in that, go and check out that channel as well. Maybe leave a subscribe. Again, your support is immensely appreciated. Alright, but at the very start of the Soul Society arc in chapters 74 and 75, after Ichigo defeats Jidanbo, the giant opens the gate to the Serete, letting the Ryoka in, only for Gin Ichimaru to greet them. In a swift move, Gin uses his Shikai Shinzo to effortlessly cut Jidanbo's entire arm off. The arm goes flying, smashing into a nearby building, leaving Jidanbo to not only roar in agony as blood erupts from the wound, but to try and keep the gate open with his one remaining arm, the entire weight of the door crashing down onto his shoulders. It's a great moment that immediately establishes both how cruel and how powerful Gin really is, but in the anime, although Gin strikes Jidanbo in the same place, in the same way, he retains his arm. Instead, he merely receives a slash wound across the forearm, and although the anime doesn't shy away from a bit of blood splatter, there's no doubt the impact is dramatically different. Early in the Urankar arc, Kubo establishes the Espada as a major threat by having Yammy and Ulquiorra invade the human world. Across chapters 191, 192, and 193, Yammy causes untold damage until Chad and Orihime arrive to not only rescue Tatsuki from certain death, but to try and hold off the monstrous Urankar for as long as possible. However, true to form, Chad is immediately defeated by Yammy, who actually rips Chad's arm to pieces, and although you don't see the act itself, you do see the aftermath on full display. It's a really savage image, with Chad's arm essentially pulled out of his body and then torn in two at the forearm as well. In the anime, the extent of the damage Yammy does to Chad is changed up considerably. Instead of pulling his arm apart with ease, Yammy simply backhands Chad and sends him flying, somehow seriously wounding his arm at the same time, blood spurting out of his shoulder even though the arm is essentially intact. And yeah, Chad's arm is in one piece here, save for a few bloodied gouges into his forearm. Perhaps the more overt, and maybe even expected change, comes a little later in this same confrontation. However, after Ichigo arrives to help out and Zangetsu begins to get in his way, Yammy starts to brutalize our main character, only for Orihime to rush in, hoping to save Ichigo from this onslaught. Instead, however, Yammy casually smacks Orihime across the face, sending her soaring backwards. It's one of the very few times we ever see Orihime getting seriously injured in the series, and the extent of the damage done to her in the manga is honestly kind of shocking. By the time she's later rescued by Yoruichi, one half of Orihime's body is absolutely drenched in blood. She looks half dead, and while it's not easy to see, her arm has also been wrecked and bent backwards, with several large lacerations in it as well. And yet, here in the anime, when Yoruichi assists Orihime, we can see that Orihime barely looks any worse for wear, save for a couple of bruises, as apparently she's capable of tanking a point-blank smack from Yammy across the face. In fact, there's another censored scene mere moments later when Ulquiorra whacks Yammy in the gut for getting ahead of himself. In the manga, Ulquiorra effectively rams his hand into Yammy's stomach. We can see Yammy clutching his injury, blood pouring out of it, and running down Ulquiorra's hand. But in the anime, however, when Ulquiorra hits Yammy, his hand merely bounces off of Yammy's gut, simply winding the espada. And this is what I mean, there must be so many of these smaller moments that it is impossible to account for them all. Then, in another incident involving Yammy in chapter 229, when Yammy's lost arm is reattached, he decides to test it out on the unfortunate Arrancar nurse who was tending to him, and it's funny to think of the newfound relevance this character, who would later turn out to be Roka Paramiya in the light novels, actually has now. But anyway, when Roka asks Yammy how his arm feels, in the manga he callously brings his giant fist down upon her head, obliterating the Rankar's head in a splatter of blood and matter. In a pretty haunting and unsettling image, Roka's headless body then staggers backwards, blood spraying from her neck like a fountain as her arm kind of spasms beside her in her last moments of life. It's a remarkably dark scene, to be honest, especially considering the manga does shy away from other moments of decapitation later on, such as when Izuru kills Avirama. Yammy notes with disgust that his newly reattached arm is no good, as he would have split her in two normally. In the anime, Yammy simply smacks Roka into a nearby wall instead, though killing her all the same. Now, to be fair to the anime, this is still a pretty grisly scene, as Roka's head quite clearly explodes in a splatter of blood upon hitting the wall, but again, it's technically hidden off screen and it's not quite as overt as the manga's version, that's for sure. In chapter 240, when Orihime has been brought before Aizen in Wako Mundo for the very first time, he has her demonstrate her divine capabilities by restoring Grimmjow's lost arm. When Grimmjow later uses that arm to kill Luppi, in the manga it is a pretty shockingly brutal moment, I'd say, as Grimmjow thrusts his arm through Luppi's chest, delivering a devastating injury to the espada, and of course in the manga you see the entire thing, Grimmjow's hand blasting out of Luppi's back, it is all there on display. And yet, in the anime, this moment is censored by simply adjusting the camera angle of the scene. While the same event takes place, and you technically see the same shot as in the manga, it has been zoomed in and angled, so that Grimmjow's hand bursting through Luppi's chest and out of his back is completely omitted, leaving what's actually going on up to the imagination. And then, once Grimmjow finishes Luppi off with a point-blank serro to the face, in the manga, Luppi's entire top half has been vaporized, as his legs crumple to the floor. And again, while the same thing technically happens here in the anime, Grimmjow himself is obscuring the fact that Luppi is now missing the entire top half of his body. As you might expect, there's an awful lot of censorship surrounding Szayel The maniacal scientist is one of the most explicitly gruesome and messed up characters in the entire Bleach manga, to the degree that yes, in the English version of the manga, even his Zanpakuto's name is censored, being changed from Fornicarus to La Lujuriosa. In chapter 276, after being seriously wounded by the combination of Renji's point-blank Shakaho and then Uryu's Sprenger ability, Szayel suddenly lashes out and grabs one of his Fraction Lumina before biting a huge chunk out of the Urankar's head. Again, it's a genuinely surprising and horrifying image, with Kubo emphasising Szayel teeth to show the animalistic nature of what's going on, the underlying hollow taint beneath Szayel otherwise gentlemanly display. After ripping apart Lumina's head, we then see Szayel holding the remains of his Fraction, its arm dangling from his mouth as he's devoured the vast majority of Lumina before their eyes, his Fraction's flesh healing his wounds. In the anime, the scene is, for all intents and purposes, left intact, but it's changed to downplay the gruesome nature of Szayel devouring his Fraction. When he grabs Lumina, the Fraction is transformed into a ball of purple energy, which the Espada then eats. And then much later into his battle, when Szayel is killed and eaten by Mayuri's bankai, he resurrects himself using his ultimate technique, Gabriel, with which he impregnates a host and then births himself from their body, essentially making it so he can never die. Yes, it's pretty messed up, and in chapter 304, we see this ability in action. With a lone tentacle still wrapped around Nemu, Szayel, who they believe to be dead, implants an egg in her through her belly button as she then swells in size, and he then feasts on her life force from the inside out, draining her of her vitality before he emerges like an ooze from the vice captain's mouth, Nemu now little more than a desiccated husk. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the anime didn't depict this ability in the same way at all. For starters, all of the impregnation imagery is completely removed, and instead a pink mist simply escapes from Nemu's mouth as Szayel is reborn within it, his body growing from a multitude of rapidly multiplying cells. And not only that, but once Szayel returns to life, Nemu herself doesn't look as withered or drained as in the manga either. The creation of the monstrous chimera Ayon has been burned into my memory as one of the anime's most absurd examples of censorship, one of their most clearly desperate attempts at finding a workaround that kind of works. In chapter 335, after being forced to release their resurrection, Harabel's Fraction decide to activate their ultimate ability, Chimera Parka, the creation of a chimera thanks to the fusion of their 3 left arms. In the manga, they each tear their arms off in a unique way. Apache just kind of rips hers off, Mila Rose cuts hers off, while Sun kind of just twists her arm off in 2 in a weird fashion, but ultimately all 3 of their arms then combine to form Ayon, an unholy abomination of pure power. It does not work this way in the anime. The anime definitely had a real problem with Kubo's absolute love of removing people's arms, which obviously they didn't want when Bleach had a primetime slot and was supposed to be, for all intents and purposes, teenager-friendly, child-friendly viewing. And so here the anime desperately invented a new way for Ayon to be born, while trying to retain the spirit of the original. While all 3 of the Fraction grab their arms as though preparing to tear them off in the same manner as the manga, something dramatically different then happens. As their arms all begin to glow a bright red, 3 laser beams blast forth from them, meeting in the middle, and generating a strange embryonic sac of sorts from which Ayon then rapidly grows before bursting out of the red light, fully formed and ready to fight. It's weird, and from that point onwards, the anime tries its best to cover up the Fraction's injuries by leaving a red disc of reishi around where their injuries are, so as to avoid as much as possible showing the stump where their arms used to be. At the same time, it is funny seeing the anime really trying its best to create a workaround and coming up with this. But of course, that leads us nicely into what may very well be the single most controversial example of censorship in the entire anime. In the following chapter 336, Ayon is born, and Kubo immediately sets about making this creature a strange and eerie beast, one that instills a striking fear into those facing it. And then, as Matsumoto stares at the chimera in horror, Kubo instantly makes good on those feelings of unease in a way we have never seen before. Ayon suddenly rockets towards Matsumoto without warning, giving no indication of its movements whatsoever, leaving the vice captain next to no time to ready herself. Although Matsumoto raises her Shikai in defense, it is too little, too late, as Ayon tears right through her, carving an enormous fleshy chunk out of her side with a single swipe of its massive hand. In my humble opinion, this is the single most gruesome moment in Bleach prior to the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. Matsumoto has her entire side essentially pulled out in gory detail, her intestines and muscles on full view. Unable to do anything but watch before passing out, Matsumoto looks on as Ayon almost childishly observes the piece of flesh in his hand. And again, I can't stress it enough, this was visceral gore on a totally different level to what we were really used to in Bleach. Bleach is a gory series in quotes, but it is very stylized and almost cartoonish, with immense dramatic blood sprays and the occasional lost arm that never really amounts to any lasting damage. But this, well, this is something else entirely, and that's clearly by design. The way Ayon then drops the still perfectly formed piece of Matsumoto flesh, blood, muscle, innards, even a bit of clothing and all from his thumb is seared into my mind. And it's an impressive piece of storytelling too, because it shows just how powerful this monster is, in that it taking Matsumoto's side out was so effortless that the piece of her that was removed is totally intact, it hasn't been damaged. Her side has been gouged out without any trouble whatsoever, and that is horrifying. And so when Matsumoto falls to the ground, when she is struggling to breathe, when Hinamori is desperately trying to save her, you really feel that tension, because this is one of the craziest injuries we have ever seen in Bleach, and the question of whether or not a Shinigami can survive it is palpable. The anime's version of this scene is laughably bad by comparison, and doesn't even really make any sense. Ayon charges Matsumoto just like in the manga, and rips right through her just as in the manga, albeit turning her into the customary silhouette, but the anime even shows a huge blood splatter. And yet, when we actually see the wound, when we actually see the extent of the damage, well, there is no damage. Matsumoto is intact, to the point where she essentially looks unharmed, save for a few scratches and bruises on her side. Again, it is laughable. We're supposed to think that she's been seriously wounded internally, I guess, but then where did the massive blood splatter come from? And to make matters even worse, later we see Ayon's hand as he lifts nothing to look at, and it's soaked in blood, but from where? Also, it's ridiculous to consider that this massive, hulking behemoth, with no restraint as far as we're concerned, charged Matsumoto head-on, clipped her side with his gigantic hand, enough to apparently injure her dramatically internally, and yet only lightly shredded her Shihakusho. It's kind of hilarious to think that after that hit, all Ayon came away with was a piece of Matsumoto's robes. And there is so much more blood on Ayon's hand in the anime too, that's the hilarious thing. And that again makes it way more powerful and effective in the manga. There isn't much blood on Ayon's hand because it wasn't messy, because Ayon is so strong that he just cleanly carves out that piece of Matsumoto's flesh. Now, I get it, this is violence the likes of which we haven't really seen before in Bleach, and so it is definitely a tough spot to put the anime in, but there's no doubt this was totally botched. Honestly, I just think it would have been much better for them to do the same thing they did with Grimmjow and Luppi, or Kenpachi and Giriko, and to just not show the injury at all, and still have it occur, imply the immense damage that's been done. Next up, we have another famous example, this time from chapter 349. During the finale of the battle against Ulquiorra, Ichigo is brutally killed by the Espada's Segunda Etapa, leaving Orihime and Uryu to fend for themselves in what appears to be a totally hopeless situation. The bleak nature of the showdown atop the dome is what separates it from every other fight in Bleach, and the abject helplessness our heroes feel permeates through their actions. Uryu continues to try and defy Ulquiorra despite being totally outmatched. If only he'd drunk Yhwach's blood by this point, am I right? While Orihime, sobbing and in despair, tries to work out what to do next, as she pretty much has a mental breakdown over Ichigo's corpse, when Uryu is suddenly flung backwards towards her. And as Orihime glances over at her friend through tears, she sees to her horror that Uryu is missing his entire hand. Blood gushes from the stump at the end of his forearm, but resilient and determined to protect Orihime, Uryu charges back into the fray, well aware that he's likely going to his death. It's such a casual way of displaying such a prominent injury, but it's all part of what makes this moment so tense. How much longer can Uryu really hold out if he's lost his entire hand so easily? Well, again, the anime removes much of that tension by massively toning Uryu's injuries down, again to the point where he may as well be unharmed. When the Quincy is thrown backwards from Ulquiorra this time, Orihime looks over to him and, well, his hand is just there, it's completely intact. In fact, it just looks a little singed and barely worse for wear. The crucial thing to remember, after all of these examples so far and with the examples still to come, is that gore, excessive gore, absolutely is not necessary to tell a story, but it can be an effective tool to ramp up the anxiety and fear felt in a particular situation, and this is one of them. The battle atop the dome is absolutely drowning in anxiety, and it shows us that while Ulquiorra isn't necessarily out to kill Uryu, he's also not messing around either and is more than strong enough to do so, and will not hesitate to savage the Quincy, something he can do with ease. In removing this, we barely have a reason to really worry about Uryu anymore, and it changes the overall darker tone of the sequence. Then, later in that same battle, once Zangetsu has awakened and taken over Ichigo's body, the anime makes a fairly significant change to Zangetsu's rampage. In chapter 350 of the manga, Zangetsu cuts off Ulquiorra's arm after overwhelming the Espada, but the most interesting change comes as a result of the events of the following chapter. In chapter 351, Zangetsu then throws that arm back at Ulquiorra in, as the Espada himself believes, an effort to unnerve him. It's a pretty cool moment, and the way Ulquiorra is so quick to instantly vaporize his own arm with his lance is an intriguing insight into his own character. The way he values his physical form so little is likely a combination of his aspect of death, but also his unmatched skill in high-speed regeneration. Yet in the anime, Zangetsu doesn't throw Ulquiorra's arm at him at all, despite still cutting it off. Instead, the sequence is changed and extended significantly, as Ulquiorra and Zangetsu clash across the dome, before Zangetsu eventually picks up and launches a massive chunk of rock at the Espada instead. It's here where we resume from where the manga left off, and Ulquiorra wonders if this boulder is meant to make him hesitate, which frankly just doesn't make sense in the same way it did in the manga now. One of the biggest criticisms levelled at the Fate Karakura Town arc is that it's a pretty bloodless affair for the Shinigami and their allies. In fact, the Gotei 13 and the Vizard coast through their battles against the Espada, losing maybe an arm or two here and there, but as I've already said, that doesn't really mean in Bleach what it means here in the real world. And that's really about it. However, 50 or so chapters after Matsumoto's horrifying injury, that all changed again in chapter 377, with another of the most shocking moments of the arc so far. With the Espada defeated, Aizen steps onto the front lines himself and successfully goaded Hiyori into charging at him. Of course, she doesn't make it, and in a masterfully brutal scene, Gin sneak attacks Hiyori with his Shikai, cutting the Vizard in half at the waist. And there are a couple of wonderful panels here. The first panel, which cuts Hiyori off at the waist where she's been struck, is excellent, with the line of the panel itself seemingly doing the slicing. But even more haunting are the panels that immediately follow. One shows Hiyori glancing back at her lower half as it falls from the sky, which is really cool, while later, once Shinji has caught her in his arms, there's another great perspective shot of her feet on the ground, while the top half of her remains with Shinji on a nearby rooftop. It is clear that Kubo was having a lot of fun with the various perspectives on this injury. If you were reading the series weekly, again, like with Matsumoto beforehand, you'll remember how big of a deal this was at the time. It really looked as though Hiyori might have been a goner. It's actually kind of ironic to look back on this and realise that actually no one died from these injuries, but there you go. Fast forward to the anime, and well, this scene is completely ruined. In the anime, Gin still attacks Hiyori, but instead of cutting her in two, he simply stabs her through the back with his Shikai instead, and yet the scene is played up in such a comically dramatic way that it simply doesn't make sense anymore. People survive being stabbed in Bleach literally all the time, yet here we are shown every Vizard reacting in total horror. That's why Hiyori being cut in half was such a big deal. It was Kubo successfully upping the ante. We know that Shinigami are already inherently sturdier than humans, which is why injuries like being stabbed aren't necessarily fatal. But having your entire side taken out, being cut in half, that was a new one, and it was terrifying. The anime totally neutered the moment, and then had the gall to give us all of these horrified reactions as though this wasn't something that had been seen a million times before. Hell, Ukitake gets an entire hand shoved through his back earlier in this same fight, and the only people who care in that moment are Kyoraku and Yamamoto. One of the most interesting censorship changes comes early into the Lost Agent arc. In chapter 436, Ichigo acquires the first stage of his Fullbring at last, with black energy erupting from his substitute Shinigami badge in the shape of... well, it is the shape of Tensa Zangetsu's guard, as everyone knows, which is the Japanese kanji for bun. Of course, it also looks a hell of a lot like a swastika. While Ichigo's bankai retained the shape of its famous guard in the anime, it seems as though they felt this imagery was perhaps a little too on the nose, maybe a little too close to the mark, and so it was censored in the anime, with Ichigo's Fullbring Reiatsu taking on a totally different shape. Here in the anime, the Reiatsu emerges from the blade in the shape of a kind of four-pronged square almost, and it remains like this when Ichigo uses this technique in battle against Jackie and Mr. Pork later on in his training. It's funny hearing Ichigo remark that this shape is Zangetsu's guard when it quite clearly isn't the same. Later in the Lost Agent arc, we get one of, in my opinion, the less forgivable changes. In chapter 455, Ichigo at last confronts Tsukishima using his completed Fullbring, and upon activating it, immediately rips Tsukishima's arm off in a display of his killing intent. Remember, context is crucial here. This is Ichigo like we've never seen him before. Tsukishima has targeted his friends and family, cutting them all with Book of the End and using that power to turn them against Ichigo, attacking him in a personal way, doing what no villain has done before, and pushing Ichigo to the absolute brink. As a result, our main character is now completely consumed by a murderous rage, having even discussed his desire to kill Tsukishima with Ginjo in the chapter prior. This is an Ichigo who will not hold back when faced with Tsukishima specifically. And so we see that here in the manga on display. Now that he's finally given the opportunity to come up against Tsukishima, Ichigo immediately blitzes his enemy at his first opportunity and slices his arm off in one move without even thinking about it. It's a savage blow, and a sign that Ichigo is too far gone to be reasoned with. And yet, in the anime, the wind is taken completely out of this moment by the absurd choice to not only censor this scene, but to change and diminish it entirely. Ichigo activates his Fullbring and lunges for Tsukishima, but rather than cut his arm clean off, he lightly slashes his hated enemy's arm instead. Ichigo has a totally clear line of sight on Tsukishima's exposed limb, and all he does is ruin his best shirt. It's just ridiculous, and the anime undermines both Ichigo's threat of cold-blooded murder and his fractured mental state all at once. Kenpachi brutally kills Giriko at the start of the Gotei 13's battle with Execution at the end of the Lost Agent arc. In the manga, once Giriko transforms in chapter 463, Kenpachi cuts him in two immediately, and on the final page of the chapter, you actually see Giriko splitting in two, blood showering the entire page in a pretty gory display, especially considering Giriko is a human, and that does actually matter to what can and can't be shown specifically in the anime. And while the anime keeps the event the same, having Kenpachi kill Giriko in the same manner, it employs the usual tried and true censorship tactic of turning Giriko himself into a silhouette against a red backdrop in an attempt to hide the full extent of what's actually happening, though to the anime's credit, it does show Giriko breaking in two here. But then for the final shot, the money shot that shows Kenpachi's bored expression in the foreground, Giriko breaking in two in the background, Giriko is entirely removed from behind Kenpachi. And so as we come to the end of this video, I hope this has been a fun trip down memory lane. Of course, I understand the realities, especially during Bleach's heyday, of wanting to make the show as appealing to a wider audience as possible, to make it as accessible as possible by toning down and censoring many of the more adult themes and moments found throughout the story. But I have to say I am absolutely grateful for the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime and the way it is more accurately able to depict many of the events that happened in the manga. There's no doubt that if the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime was released back in 2012, when the anime was still going, when it was just finishing up, and it had to be censored in the same way, I really think that would have been of a huge detriment to the arc overall. Alright guys, well that's it for today's video. As always, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Make sure to let me know down in the comments below which of these moments of censorship stood out to you the most, which one do you remember the most, do you recall from back in the day, especially if you were an original anime viewer who was watching it weekly. Are there any major moments of censorship that you remember that I left out? Remember, I said at the start of this video there are going to be tons of moments littered all throughout the anime, so there's no way I can realistically get to them all. Maybe it's something like Aizen trying to kill Ichigo at the end of the Soul Society arc, carving him down to his spine in the manga, and yet clearly not quite doing that in the anime. Whatever it is, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already. Also consider checking out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games. Again, your support does mean the absolute world to me. And as always, I want to end today's video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon. Your support does mean absolutely everything. It makes the world of difference, and I can't thank you enough. So please do consider supporting me over there as well if you want to help take your support for the channel another step further and receive every single one of my videos completely free of YouTube ads. Alright guys, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.